When I was in high school, I was taking an English class, and instead of doing my work, I was writing instead. And I got caught by my teacher, and he sent what I wrote to a friend of his who is a kind of a famous writer in North America. And that writer got back to me about 3 months later, and he had fully edited what I wrote and said I had the fire of a good storyteller. And so after that, I went to school for theater and didn't think about writing for years and years, but that letter always kind of stuck in my head. And so when it came time to try again, it kind of gave me the confidence to take a shot at it. There was a very specific book I was reading from my favorite author, Guy Gavriel Kay, that made me decide to take it seriously. But I had to work. I worked in restaurants for a long time, so luckily working in restaurants allows you to have a lot of spare time. And it was probably about 15 years between when I first started to write seriously and between when I got published. So it took a long time. And even after I got published for about 2 years, I worked in restaurants as well. And only recently was able to write for a living.
Hi, I'm Nicholas Eames, the author of Kings of the Wild, or Rejas de la Tierra Salvaje.
It definitely was a big surprise to everyone except my mom. But otherwise, yeah, it's always been kind of humbling for me. And when you get good news, at least when I get good news, I kind of soak it in for about 5 or 10 minutes and really enjoy it. And then I kind of pack it away and keep it for a rainy day. And that's the same with bad news too. So whenever you find out I find out I'm getting published in a new language or something like that, I feel very grateful, always a little surprised, and delighted for a while. And I'll go buy myself a bottle of scotch to celebrate. But yeah, I just kind of, it comes in waves and then it goes away as well. So I just try to, enjoy it as much as I can, but not get too hung up on it. But to be able to come to Spain is a huge, huge honor. I absolutely love it here. Meeting the readers have been absolutely incredible, very enthusiastic. And yeah, it's been really, really rewarding to meet everyone. Not only my publishing team as well, but the readers of the book. There are a lot of references in there. I've probably forgotten at least half of them. Whenever I reread it, I discover ones that I'd completely forgot that I put in there. To come up with the idea itself, I was listening to a band called Rush, which is a Canadian rock band. And the idea just came to me, what if mercenary bands were afforded the same sort of fame and notoriety as rock bands? I was sure that someone had written it before, so I looked it up to see because I wanted to read that book, and no one had yet, so I wrote it as fast as I could. And I feel pretty lucky that I thought of the idea because if someone else had thought of it first, they'd probably write a pretty good book as well. Once I knew I wanted to do a book about music and rock in general, the idea of getting the band back together is kind of a classic musical trope that you see in movies like the Blues Brothers and things like that. So it felt like a pretty natural story to tell, and especially since I knew I wanted to tell one that was funny, that was a good place to start too, I think. A bunch of older gentlemen going out with their backs hurt, and I think it's a kind of, it lends itself to humor really, really well. When I wrote the first book, I knew I wanted it to be, it was a story of one last journey between a group of friends, and I didn't want to kind of cheapen that by dragging them out on adventure after adventure for the course for 2 more books, even though I dragged them out a little bit. So when it came time to tell the second story, Rose seemed the natural fit. I wanted the world itself to kind of move into the next generation, for the reader to be able to see the world evolve. Not only especially because of the actions of the characters in the first book, it becomes a very different world, and that moves on into the third book as well. And in the second book, I use another pretty conventional rock trope, which is the journalist on the road with the rock band, which is from movies like Almost Famous, where someone who's kind of young and impressionable, who worships these people as heroes, gets to kind of take a closer look and see them as human beings as well. Oof, it depends on the person. Some of us learn from the past if we care to, learn about it. I think in the case of these books, a lot of it is trying to separate yourself from the past. And the past kind of casts a very big shadow. And so you want to kind of make things bigger and better and louder and faster. And I think that was kind of true for when you look at rock bands of the 80s trying to, paint their faces and spike their hair and drink to excess and just kind of go crazy. They were kind of trying to do everything that came before, but better. And then things did evolve into the next generation was kind of less about trying to mimic the past and more about trying to create their own present, and tell their own stories. So yeah, it's hard to say. Ultimately, as these books go on, the characters from the first book are involved in the second, the characters from the first and second are involved in the third, and eventually all the characters will sort of be together. So their personalities, their points of view will all clash. And some of them come from very different worlds, especially the characters in the first book come from a world where monsters hunted them, kicked down their door and attacked them in the middle of the night. And by the time the second book comes around, it's monsters that are living in their caves and humans come in and kick down the door in the middle of the night. And then in the third book, all of them are in the same boat and oppressed by someone that's got a lot more power than them. I think the world itself these days could use heroes that can see things from both people's perspectives and more perspectives than just their own. I think a lot of people today get villainized. A lot of people are very self-righteous. I'm guilty of this as well. And we're quick to condemn each other. And I think understanding each other is pretty important too. And I suppose if you come to a part where you can't understand each other, then maybe resort to the sword.
Ronda rápida de preguntas típicas.
I think you make yourself into a writer. Or you could say that I was born because I think everyone could be one if they wanted to. I think everyone's got a story to tell. It's just a matter of wanting to tell it in the first place and learning the craft itself, which usually requires reading, but sometimes doesn't at all. I think absolutely anyone could be a writer. My uncle and my brother, my mom always say, "Oh, you should tell this story of my life," and I say, "Tell it yourself. Like you tell it better than I could." So I think everyone could be one. But yes, it does obviously require a willingness to put a lot of time in order to succeed at it. I am normally a pantser. Especially with these books in particular. I wanted them to feel as surprising as possible every chapter. With Kings of the Wild especially, within 3 chapters you know where the book is going to end because the whole point of the book is them getting there. So when you're going from point A to point B, I think it's important to go through the whole rest of the alphabet between those two. So every few chapters, I would think to myself, what would happen next? What's very obviously going to happen next? And then try to not have that happen and have it go completely different ways. So for me, things like having airships in my book was very useful because they can speed up or slow down the journey so much. So suddenly one appears and the reader goes, "Oh, things aren't going the way I thought they were." And then suddenly one crashes and they think, "Okay, I guess we're walking again." So yeah, I think I tried to add as many elements as possible to surprise myself while I was writing and hopefully readers while they're reading. So every 3 or 4 chapters, you're in a place completely different than you were before, and things don't get too stale. Not particularly, no. Sometimes I do choose my swear words a bit carefully, only because maybe some of them I feel are too crass, but I'll just find a less crass swear word. I still will swear. It's more, when it comes to censoring myself, it's more a matter of making the humor not too absurd, that it kind of takes away from the more poignant parts of the book. And in that case, it's often my editors that will say, "Could we just tone this down a little bit?" And I almost always listen to exactly what they say. I think, well, some people were very productive during COVID. I was not one of those people. I think when the world you see people around you suffering or having a difficult time, at least for myself, it kind of gets in my head and it's hard to kind of put that away and compartmentalize it and get to work. It's more things like this, being able to come to Spain, being able to interact with readers, being able to meet the editing teams that took a chance on me and made my career so much more rich. Those kind of things, to me at least, are much more inspiring. So being trapped, being cooped up in my house, not so much, but being able to remember why I did it in the first place has been a tremendous inspiration to me. And I think I'll go back and I'll have the book done in about a week, I think. I think there's definitely a place for older heroes. I think everyone seemed to, a lot of fantasy readers have grown up reading classic fantasy, and some of them are growing older as well. So it's probably nice to see characters that aren't simply relegated to being like an old wizard or a wise mentor. Instead, they get to be the heroes of the books. And when I wrote the second book, which involves a lot younger people, a lot of readers were like, oh, we miss the old guys. Can we please have them back someday? So I think there's definitely a space for them. And I know I love reading them myself.
El traductor del libro, que es David Tejera, porque David era un latoso. Todo el tiempo le estaba escribiendo a Nick porque quería el libro en español, quería el libro en español, quería el libro en español.
Yes, that's a great question, by the way. That's a huge part of these books because they take inspiration from musical eras. The 70s for the first book, the 80s for the second book, 90s for the third. And using different characters, you get to see what one generation thinks of the generation before it, what the generation before it thinks of the generation after it. And I think that's something that a lot of people can relate to. Yeah, and like you said, so many fantasy books, the world stays very static. There's drastic changes between the first and the second book, and very drastic changes between the second book and the third book. It will make for, even though each book is a very standalone story, I think it will make for a very nice arc once they're all complete and you get to see how things are resolved. Well, I used to read a lot of historical fiction, books about ancient Rome and Carthage and Spain. I loved those kind of books. But these days I primarily read fantasy, only because I get a lot of them sent to me for free. And I've met a lot of author friends who I really admire, and I would like to read their books. And then, I never understand when someone is chomping at the bit for a new author, like a new book to come out, because there's so many other authors to read. So I primarily read fantasy, and I'm very, very far behind in my reading list. As far as authors that I really love, books that I've loved lately, by authors who are not named Caja, Jade City by Fonda Lee is fantastic. It's sort of a Kung Fu Hong Kong 1970s gangster story, and it's very much about family and kind of like a crime drama book. It's fantastic. There's also a book called The Traitor Beru Cormorant by a man named Seth Dickinson, which is fantastic. It's about this young woman who is part of a society that's oppressed by an all-consuming empire, and the only way she knows how to destroy it is by working for it and going inside. And she is essentially an accountant. So it's a book where an accountant saves the world, which is, I think, a pretty rare thing. Some of my favorite writers and ones that have inspired my career especially, Guy Gavriel Kay is my favorite writer of all time. He writes sort of historical fiction, fantasy type stories. All of them are heartbreaking. All of them are beautiful. Every sentence is pretty much perfect. Other writers, though, Joe Abercrombie is a huge inspiration to me. His books are grimdark, but they're also very, very funny, I think. Almost every chapter I'm laughing at something, even if it's someone's despair, and I absolutely love them. And an author named Scott Lynch, who wrote The Lies of Locke Lamora. That book is unputdownable. It's from start to finish. I think it's just exquisitely well written. And it also has a lot of humor in it as well. So these writers that kind of add a little dose of humor into their books are definitely what made me think that I could add it into mine as well.